There's a moment that happens in relationships that almost everyone notices, but very few people know how to explain. You're sitting close to someone. Maybe you're having a deep conversation. Maybe it's after physical intimacy. Maybe it's one of those rare moments where emotions are finally being shared honestly. And suddenly, something changes. The temperature of the interaction drops. Their eyes shift away. Their body stiffens. Their responses become mechanical. You can feel them leaving emotionally while still sitting right beside you. And what makes this confusing is that nothing obvious happened. No argument, no betrayal, no conflict. Yet the connection suddenly feels off. This is one of the most misunderstood parts of avoidant attachment dynamics. People assume avoidants are emotionally cold, manipulative, or uncaring. But most of the time, what you're witnessing is not a lack of feeling. It's a nervous system protecting itself from vulnerability. And the deeper the intimacy becomes, the stronger those protective reactions can get. Today, we're going to break down 4 specific things avoidants commonly do during intimacy that create emotional confusion in relationships. On-ships. Not to shame them, not to diagnose people, but to understand the behavioral patterns underneath the surface. Because once you understand the pattern, the behavior stops feeling random. The first thing avoidants often do during intimacy that feels deeply unsettling is emotional disappearing. This happens right after moments of closeness. You finally connect. They open up. They seem warm, affectionate, emotionally available, and then suddenly they pull away for no visible reason. This confuses people because the withdrawal comes immediately after connection, not conflict. To someone with a secure nervous system, intimacy creates calm. To an avoidant nervous system, intimacy can create exposure. And exposure creates danger. So after closeness, many avoidants subconsciously regulate themselves by creating distance. Sometimes physical distance, sometimes emotional distance, sometimes psychological distance. They may become quiet, distracted, detached. And because they often don't fully understand why they're doing it themselves, they'll give vague explanations. I'm just tired. I need space. I don't know what's wrong. But the real issue is nervous system overload. The intimacy became too real. The second thing avoidants do during intimacy that feels off is turning emotional moments into intellectual conversations. Watch carefully when vulnerability enters the room. Instead of staying emotionally present, many avoidants move upward into analysis. You say something emotional, and they respond like a therapist, a lawyer, or a scientist. They explain feelings instead of feeling them. They dissect the relationship instead of participating in it. And this creates a strange emotional imbalance where one person feels emotionally exposed while the other feels emotionally armored. This happens because intellectualization creates distance from vulnerability. Logic feels safer than emotion. Analysis feels safer than surrender. And avoidants often learned very early in life that emotions were overwhelming, dangerous, embarrassing, or ignored. So they developed a survival strategy. Stay mentally active so you never become emotionally vulnerable. The problem is that intimacy requires emotional participation, not just understanding. Someone can understand your pain intellectually while still remaining emotionally unavailable. And partner, RS feel that difference immediately. The third behavior that feels deeply off is physical presence with emotional absence. This one is difficult to explain unless you've experienced it. An avoidant can be physically beside you while psychologically somewhere else entirely. Their body is there, but their energy disappears. You'll notice delayed reactions, reduced eye contact, minimal facial responsiveness, flat tone changes, mechanical affection. And what's important here is that most avoidants are not consciously trying to hurt someone. In many cases, they are dissociating from emotional intensity without realizing it. Their nervous system is attempting to reduce stimulation. Think of it like an emotional circuit breaker. Too much closeness, too much vulnerability, too much dependence. So the system partially shuts down. The partner experiences this as rejection because humans are extremely sensitive to emotional attunement. We can feel when someone is emotionally present and when they're psychologically retreating. And when this happens repeatedly, the relationship starts developing emotional instability. One person keeps reaching for connection. The other keeps unconsciously retreating from it. That cycle creates anxiety, resentment, and emotional exhaustion. The fourth thing avoidants do during intimacy that feels off is creating subtle control through unpredictability. This is where relationships become psychologically disorienting. Avoidants often alternate between warmth and distance without explanation. One day they seem deeply connected, the next day they feel unreachable. This inconsistency creates something powerful in relationships: emotional uncertainty. And uncertainty increases emotional fixation. Human beings become psychologically attached to unpredictability because the brain keeps searching for resolution. What changed? Did I do something wrong? How do I get the closeness back? Now, here's the important part. Many avoidants are not doing this deliberately. Most are reacting automatically to internal discomfort they don't fully understand. But regardless of intention, the impact on the partner can become emotionally destabilizing. Because stable intimacy requires consistency, not perfection, not constant closeness, but emotional reliability. And when intimacy repeatedly alternates between connection and withdrawal, the relationship slowly becomes emotionally unsafe. This is why so many people leave relationships with avoidance questioning their own worth, attractiveness, or emotional stability. But understanding these behaviors changes the interpretation completely. You stop seeing random cruelty, and you start seeing protective adaptation. That does not excuse harmful behavior, but it explains it. Avoidants often learned early in life that vulnerability led to disappointment, engulfment, criticism, rejection, or emotional suffocation. So closeness itself became associated with danger, which creates the central contradiction of avoidant attachment. They want love, but intimacy activates fear. And until that contradiction is consciously addressed, relationships can start feeling emotionally confusing for everyone involved. Avoidants often live with a contradiction that confuses both themselves and the people who love them. On the surface, they may appear independent, emotionally distant, or completely comfortable being alone. But underneath that exterior is usually a very real desire for closeness, connection, affection, and emotional safety. The problem is not that they not want love. The problem is that love activates fear at the exact same time it activates desire. This creates an internal conflict that most people around them never fully see. Many avoidant individuals learned early in life that depending on other people was emotionally risky. Their experiences may have taught them that vulnerability leads to disappointment, rejection, criticism, pressure, or emotional overwhelm. As a result, their nervous system adapted by prioritizing self-protection over emotional dependence. Over time, independence stopped being just a preference and became a survival strategy. They learned to rely on themselves because relying on others once felt unsafe. This is why avoidants can appear deeply interested in someone one moment and emotionally unavailable the next. When connection is light, playful, or emotionally controlled, they often feel comfortable and engaged. But as intimacy deepens, something shifts internally. Emotional closeness starts triggering unconscious alarm systems. The relationship begins to feel less like excitement and more like exposure. Suddenly, the very thing they wanted starts feeling dangerous to their nervous system. What makes this difficult for partners is that the avoidant person's behavior can feel contradictory. They may pursue closeness, initiate affection, and express genuine care, only to later withdraw emotionally when the relationship becomes more intimate. To the other person, this can feel confusing, hurtful, or even manipulative. But in many cases, the avoidant individual is not consciously trying to create pain. They are reacting automatically to internal discomfort they do not fully understand themselves. The nervous system plays a massive role here. Human beings are biologically wired to seek connection, but they are also wired to avoid perceived danger. For avoidance, emotional dependence can unconsciously register as danger because closeness threatens their sense of control and emotional safety. Vulnerability creates uncertainty. Dependence creates risk. Intimacy requires emotional exposure, and exposure can feel terrifying for someone whose nervous system was trained to avoid emotional unpredictability. As a result, avoidants often cope by creating distance whenever relationships become emotionally intense. Some withdraw physically. Others become emotionally numb, distracted, overly logical, or focused on work and personal space. Some suddenly feel trapped even in healthy relationships. Others convince themselves they have lost feelings when in reality they are simply overwhelmed by emotional closeness. Their mind interprets vulnerability as pressure, even when the relationship itself is safe. This pattern can leave both people feeling disconnected. The avoidant feels misunderstood and pressured, while their partner feels rejected and emotionally abandoned. Over time, both sides become exhausted by the push and pull dynamic. One person reaches for reassurance, while the other instinctively pulls away to regain emotional control. But understanding this dynamic changes the way these behaviors are interpreted. Avoidants are not always running from love itself. Often, they are running from the fear of losing themselves inside love. They crave connection deeply, yet their nervous system associates dependence with danger. Until that fear is recognized and healed, intimacy will continue feeling both desirable and threatening at the same time. One of the most confusing experiences people have with avoidant individuals is realizing that their words and body language often tell completely different stories. An avoidant may calmly say, "I'm okay, everything's fine, or nothing's wrong," while their physical behavior communicates tension, withdrawal, discomfort, or emotional absence. For partners, this contradiction creates emotional confusion because human beings naturally trust nonverbal communication more than spoken language. Long before people analyze words, they instinctively read posture, facial expressions, eye contact, tone, and physical responsiveness. When the body says one thing and the mouth says another, the nervous system notices immediately. This disconnect usually happens because avoidants become skilled at suppressing or minimizing emotional experiences internally. Many learned early in life that openly expressing vulnerability either created problems or solved nothing. Some grew up in emotionally dismissive environments where feelings were ignored, criticized, or treated as weakness. Others experienced relationships where emotional needs felt overwhelming or unsafe. Over time, they adapted by learning how to contain emotion rather than express it openly. They became experts at appearing calm while experiencing significant internal stress underneath the surface. The body, however, often reveals what the conscious mind is trying to hide. An avoidant may insist they are comfortable during an intimate conversation while simultaneously crossing their arms tightly, avoiding eye contact, turning their body away, or becoming physically stiff. They may claim they want closeness while subtly leaning away, checking their phone repeatedly, spacing out mentally, or emotionally disengaging from the interaction. In some cases, their face becomes emotionally flat, or their tone loses warmth, even though their words remain reassuring. To the partner, this creates a powerful feeling that something is wrong even when no direct conflict is happening. This contradiction becomes especially noticeable during moments of emotional vulnerability. The closer the interaction gets to deep emotional intimacy, the more the avoidant nervous system may begin signaling danger internally. Because avoidants often struggle to verbalize emotional discomfort in real time, the body starts expressing the stress first. Muscles tighten, eye contact decreases, facial expressions harden, breathing changes, attention drifts. The person may append, ear physically present but emotionally somewhere else entirely. What makes this difficult is that avoidants themselves are not always fully aware of these nonverbal signals. Much of this behavior happens automatically. The nervous system is reacting faster than conscious thought. While they may genuinely believe they are fine, their body is already moving into self-protection mode. Emotional withdrawal can happen subtly and unconsciously before they intellectually recognize what they are feeling. Partners often interpret these mixed signals personally. They begin questioning themselves, wondering if they said something wrong or if the relationship is secretly failing. This uncertainty can create anxiety because humans depend heavily on emotional attunement for a sense of safety. When someone's body language consistently communicates distance while their words deny it, trust in the interaction slowly weakens. The partner no longer knows whether to believe what they hear or what they feel. Another important factor is that avoidants often prioritize emotional control. Admitting vulnerability out loud can feel extremely uncomfortable because it requires surrendering emotional defeat, NSEs. Saying "I feel overwhelmed," "I'm scared," or "I need reassurance" may feel too exposing. Instead, they default to emotionally neutral language, while their body continues to express the underlying discomfort indirectly. The result is a relationship dynamic where important emotions remain trapped beneath the surface, leaking out through nonverbal behavior instead of honest communication. Over time, this pattern can become emotionally exhausting for both people involved. The avoidant feels pressured by emotional intensity they cannot fully explain, while the partner feels disconnected from someone who appears physically present but emotionally unavailable. The relationship starts operating in a constant state of uncertainty because emotional signals are inconsistent. Understanding this dynamic changes the interpretation of the behavior. The contradiction between words and body language is often not intentional deception. It is usually evidence of an internal struggle between the desire for connection and the fear of emotional exposure. The avoidant mind may be trying to maintain stability and control, while the body quietly reveals the stress of intimacy underneath. Intimacy has a unique way of exposing the parts of people they work hardest to protect. For avoidant individuals, emotional closeness can create an intense feeling of vulnerability that their nervous system interprets as a loss of control. Even when they genuinely care about someone, they may not always show it. Deep emotional moments can trigger internal discomfort that feels overwhelming, unfamiliar, or psychologically unsafe. As a result, many avoidants unconsciously try to regain emotional balance by controlling the interaction in subtle ways. These behaviors are rarely obvious or intentionally harmful, but they often leave partners feeling emotionally disconnected and confused. One of the most common control behaviors is creating distance the moment vulnerability increases. A conversation may start warm and emotionally connected, but as soon as emotions deepen, the avoidant suddenly changes energy. They may physically pull away, become quieter, emotionally shut down, or create excuses to leave the interaction entirely. To the partner, this shift feels abrupt and emotionally disorienting because the closeness seemed mutual just moments earlier. But internally, the avoidant nervous system may already be signaling danger. Emotional intimacy starts feeling too exposing, and distance becomes a way to restore psychological safety. Another common behavior is changing the subject during emotionally vulnerable moments. When conversations begin moving toward pain, needs, fears, or emotional dependency, avoidants often redirect attention elsewhere without realizing it. They may suddenly talk about work, practical tasks, future plans, or unrelated problems. Sometimes the shift is so smooth that it almost goes unnoticed at first. But over time, partners begin recognizing a pattern where emotional conversations never fully reach depth before being interrupted or redirected. The avoidant is not necessarily rejecting the other person's emotions directly. Instead, they are unconsciously steering the interaction away from emotional territory that feels difficult to tolerate. Humor is another powerful defense mechanism many avoidants use during intimacy. Joking can instantly reduce emotional intensity and create psychological distance without openly refusing connection. During serious or vulnerable conversations, avoidants may suddenly tease, laugh things off, use sarcasm, or make the interaction feel light. Here then is. On the surface, this may seem harmless or even charming. But when humor repeatedly appears at moments requiring emotional honesty, it often functions as emotional avoidance disguised as playfulness. The nervous system uses laughter to escape vulnerability before it becomes too uncomfortable. Intellectualization is another major control strategy. Instead of emotionally participating in vulnerable moments, avoidants often move into analysis mode. They explain emotions rather than experience them. They discuss relationship dynamics like a debate instead of an emotional exchange. They may sound calm, logical, and highly self-aware while remaining emotionally disconnected underneath. This creates a strange imbalance where one person feels emotionally exposed while the avoidant remains mentally protected behind analysis and reasoning. This analytical approach serves an important psychological function. Emotions feel unpredictable and uncontrollable, while logic feels structured and manageable. By turning intimacy into a problem-solving exercise, avoidants can maintain emotional distance while still appearing engaged in the conversation. To the partner, however, it often feels cold or emotionally empty, because understanding emotions intellectually is not the same as emotionally sharing them. Control behaviors during intimacy are ultimately about emotional regulation. Avoidants often fear becoming emotionally overwhelmed, dependent, trapped, or consumed by vulnerability. Because of this, they instinctively try to reduce emotional intensity whenever closeness becomes too strong. Distance restores control. Humor restores comfort. Analysis restores stability. Topic changes restore emotional safety. The difficult part is that these behaviors slowly interfere with genuine intimacy. Real emotional connection requires presence during vulnerable moments, not escape from them. Partners begin sensing that every deep interaction eventually hits an invisible wall. Conversations lose emotional depth. Vulnerability feels one-sided. Emotional closeness becomes unpredictable. Over time, this creates frustration and emotional loneliness within the relationship. One person keeps reaching for deeper connection while the other unconsciously manages closeness by controlling emotional exposure. The avoidant may not even realize how automatic these patterns have become because they developed long ago as survival strategies designed to prevent emotional pain. Understanding these behaviors changes the way they are interpreted. The avoidant is often not trying to dominate or manipulate the relationship intentionally. They are trying to protect themselves from emotional experiences their nervous system still associates with danger. The problem is that control may reduce anxiety temporarily, but it also prevents the very intimacy they secretly crave from fully developing. One of the most painful experiences in relationships is feeling someone emotionally disappear right in front of you. An avoidant person may suddenly become distant, numb, quiet, detached, or emotionally unreachable during moments that require closeness. To the partner, this can feel cold, confusing, and deeply personal. It often creates the impression that the avoidant simply does not care. But in many cases, emotional shutdown is not cruelty. It is protection. What looks like indifference on the outside is often an unconscious defense mechanism built long before the current relationship ever existed. Avoidant individuals frequently learned early in life that strong emotions are not to be trusted. Ions were unsafe, overwhelming, or unsupported. Some grew up in homes where emotional needs were ignored or minimized. Others experienced criticism, emotional inconsistency, rejection, or environments where vulnerability created discomfort instead of comfort. Over time, their nervous system adapted by reducing emotional exposure as a way to survive emotionally stressful situations. Instead of moving toward vulnerability, they learned to move away from it. This adaptation often becomes deeply automatic. By adulthood, many avoidants do not consciously decide to shut down emotionally. Their nervous system reacts before their conscious mind fully understands what is happening. During emotionally intense moments, their internal stress levels begin rising rapidly. The body perceives vulnerability as danger, even when the relationship itself is safe. As a result, the nervous system attempts to reduce emotional stimulation by disconnecting from feelings altogether. This emotional shutdown can appear in many subtle ways. The avoidant may suddenly become expressionless, distracted, emotionally flat, or mentally distant during serious conversations. Their responses may become short, logical, or emotionally empty. Sometimes they stop making eye contact or appear exhausted and withdrawn without explanation. In more intense situations, they may physically leave, go silent for long periods, or avoid communication entirely after emotional closeness. To the partner, this behavior often feels rejecting because emotional attunement is one of the main ways humans experience safety in relationships. When someone emotionally disappears during vulnerable moments, it naturally creates feelings of abandonment, confusion, and insecurity. The partner may start wondering if they said something wrong, became too emotional, or somehow caused the withdrawal. Over time, repeated shutdowns can slowly damage emotional trust within the relationship. What makes this especially difficult is that avoidants themselves often feel misunderstood during these moments. Internally, they may experience emotional overload, pressure, fear, guilt, or confusion they cannot fully explain. But because they struggle to communicate these emotions directly, the shutdown becomes their default coping mechanism. Silence feels safer than vulnerability. Numbness feels safer than emotional exposure. Distance feels safer than emotional dependence. Many avoidants are not trying to punish or manipulate their partner when they shut down emotionally. In fact, some are trying to prevent conflict or protect themselves from feelings they fear will become overwhelming. The problem is that emotional withdrawal may reduce anxiety temporarily for the avoidant while creating emotional pain for the other person. The nervous system finds relief, but the relationship loses connection. Another important factor is that avoidants often associate emotional intensity with loss of control. Vulnerability requires openness, unpredictability, and emotional surrender. For someone whose survival strategies depend on maintaining emotional self-control, this can feel terrifying beneath the surface. Emotional shutdown becomes a way to regain stability when intimacy feels too intense to manage. Over time, this pattern creates a painful cycle. One person reaches for emotional connection while the avoidant unconsciously retreats to protect themselves. The more disconnected the partner feels, the more they may pursue reassurance or clarity. The more pressure the avoidant senses, the more their nervous system may shut down. And again, both people end up feeling emotionally unsafe in different ways. Understanding emotional shutdown changes how the behavior is interpreted. What appears cold on the surface is often rooted in fear, not lack of feeling. Many avoidants care deeply but have never learned how to remain emotionally present during vulnerability without feeling psychologically threatened. Their shutdown is not proof they are emotionless. It is evidence that somewhere in their past, emotional closeness became associated with pain, overwhelm, or danger. Until those old protective patterns are recognized and healed, the nervous system will continue choosing emotional distance as a form of self-protection, even inside relationships where genuine love exists. One of the most emotionally destabilizing aspects of being close to an avoidant person is the inconsistency. At times, they can appear deeply loving, attentive, emotionally available, and fully invested in the relationship. They may initiate closeness, communicate openly, show affection, and create moments that feel incredibly genuine and emotionally safe. But then, sometimes without warning, the energy changes completely. The warmth disappears. Communication becomes distant. Affection decreases. Emotional presence fades. To the partner, it can feel like the relationship suddenly shifted overnight without explanation. This inconsistency creates confusion because human beings naturally search for patterns in relationships. When someone moves unpredictably between closeness and emotional distance, the partner's nervous system struggles to understand what is happening. They begin replaying conversations in their mind, searching for mistakes, trying to identify the exact moment something changed. The uncertainty becomes emotionally exhausting because there is no clear reason attached to the withdrawal. What makes this dynamic especially painful is that the avoidance warmth is often very real. During moments of emotional openness, they may genuinely feel connected, loving, and safe. They may deeply enjoy intimacy and closeness while it feels manageable to their nervous system. But as emotional dependency increases, internal discomfort often begins building beneath the surface. The relationship starts feeling emotionally intense, vulnerable, or psychologically consuming. Even if nothing unhealthy is happening externally, the avoidant nervous system may interpret growing intimacy as a threat to emotional independence or self-protection. As a result, they unconsciously pull away to regulate themselves emotionally. Sometimes the shift is subtle. They text less frequently, become distracted during conversations, or stop initiating affection. Other times, the withdrawal feels dramatic and immediate. Someone who seemed emotionally present yesterday suddenly feels detached, irritated, or emotionally unreachable today. The partner experiences emotional whiplash because the contrast between connection and withdrawal is so strong. This unpredictability slowly affects emotional safety within the relationship. Healthy intimacy depends heavily on consistency. People need to feel that emotional connection will not disappear every time closeness deepens. When affection and availability become unpredictable, the partner's nervous system enters a state of hyperawareness. They begin monitoring moods, behaviors, tone changes, and emotional shifts constantly. Instead of relaxing into the relationship, they become anxious about losing connection again. Over time, partners often start blaming themselves for the inconsistency. They assume they became too emotional, too needy, or somehow pushed the avoidant away. They may work harder to maintain harmony, suppress their own needs, or carefully manage interactions to avoid triggering another withdrawal. This creates an unhealthy emotional imbalance where one person increasingly sacrifices emotional security in order to preserve connection. What makes the situation even more confusing is that avoidants themselves are often unaware of how inconsistent they appear. Internally, their emotional shifts feel connected to stress, overwhelm, vulnerability, or a need for space. They may not realize how sudden or destabilizing their behavioral changes feel to the other person. Because many avoidants struggle to communicate emotional discomfort directly, the withdrawal often happens without explanation. Silence replaces clarity. Distance replaces reassurance. This leaves the partner emotionally suspended between hope and uncertainty. The warmth eventually returns, which reinforces emotional attachment and creates relief. But because the withdrawal also returns unpredictably, the relationship begins operating in cycles of connection and emotional loss. The partner never fully knows which version of the avoidant they will encounter from one moment to the next. Psychologically, inconsistency can become highly addictive because the brain becomes fixated on restoring emotional connection. Moments of warmth feel intensely valuable precisely because they are unpredictable. The partner starts chasing emotional stability, hoping the closeness will finally become permanent. But the repeated cycle of intimacy, followed by detachment, slowly creates emotional exhaustion and insecurity. Understanding this dynamic changes the interpretation of the avoidance behavior. Their inconsistency is often not calculated manipulation or intentional cruelty. In many cases, it reflects an internal struggle between the desire for closeness and the fear of emotional dependence. They move toward intimacy when connection feels safe and rewarding, then retreat when vulnerability begins activating old protective fears. The problem is that relationships cannot feel emotionally secure when connection repeatedly disappears without warning. Until avoidants learn how to tolerate intimacy without instinctively withdrawing from it, their relationships often become ionally confusing places where love and distance exist side by side, leaving partners constantly unsure of where they truly stand. One of the most powerful moments in any relationship dynamic happens when confusion is finally replaced with understanding. For people involved with avoidant individuals, this shift can completely change the emotional experience of the relationship. Before awareness, every withdrawal feels personal. Every moment of distance feels like rejection. Every emotional shutdown feels like proof that something is wrong with the relationship or with the person being pushed away. The mind naturally searches for explanations, and without understanding attachment patterns, people often blame themselves for behavior that was never truly about them in the first place. This is why awareness changes everything. Once people begin recognizing avoidant patterns clearly, they stop interpreting every emotional shift as a reflection of their worth. They start seeing the deeper psychological process underneath the behavior. The sudden withdrawal, emotional shutdown, inconsistency, need for space, or discomfort during intimacy no longer appears random or mysterious. It became understandable as part of a protective system developed long before the current relationship ever existed. This understanding creates emotional clarity. Instead of immediately reacting with panic, self-blame, or emotional chasing, people begin responding with greater stability. They realize that avoidant behaviors are often triggered by vulnerability, emotional intensity, fear of dependence, or nervous system overwhelm rather than a complete absence of care or love. This does not mean harmful behavior becomes acceptable, but it changes the emotional interpretation of what is happening. Without awareness, relationships with avoidance can feel emotionally chaotic. One person keeps trying harder to restore connection, while the avoidant keeps pulling away to regain emotional control. The more distance appears, the more anxiety increases. The more anxiety increases, the more emotional pressure enters the relationship. Eventually, both people become trapped in reactive patterns driven by fear rather than understanding. Awareness interrupts this cycle because it introduces emotional objectivity. People stop reacting purely from wounded emotion and begin observing the dynamic more clearly, early. They recognize that chasing, over-explaining, demanding reassurance, or emotionally collapsing during moments of withdrawal often intensifies the avoidance instinct to create even more distance. At the same time, they also recognize that constantly suppressing their own needs to maintain connection creates emotional resentment and self-abandonment. This clarity allows people to make healthier decisions. Some relationships improve because both individuals become more conscious of their patterns and begin communicating more honestly. The avoidant learns to recognize when their nervous system is activating defensive behaviors, while the partner learns not to automatically personalize every moment of emotional distance. Conversations become calmer because both people understand the underlying triggers instead of reacting only to surface behaviors. Awareness also helps people separate love from unhealthy dynamics. Many individuals stay trapped in emotionally unstable relationships because they keep interpreting inconsistency as a sign they need to try harder. They believe that if they become more patient, more understanding, less emotional, or more perfect, the avoidant will succeed, dreadfully feel safe enough to stop withdrawing. But awareness reveals an important truth. Attachment patterns are deeply rooted nervous system responses, not simple communication problems that one partner can fix alone. This realization can be painful, but it is also freeing. People stop carrying responsibility for emotional patterns that were formed long before they entered the relationship. They stop viewing every withdrawal as evidence of personal failure. Instead of operating from emotional desperation, they begin evaluating relationships based on consistency, emotional availability, and mutual effort. For avoidants themselves, awareness is equally transformative. Many have spent years believing they simply lose feelings, need excessive space, or are incapable of closeness. But once they recognize their own protective patterns, they can begin understanding that their reactions are often fear-based rather than truth-based. Emotional withdrawal stops feeling random and starts becoming observable. They begin noticing how vulnerability activates discomfort and how quickly their nervous system moves towards self-protection during intimacy. This awareness creates the possibility for or change because unconscious patterns lose power once they become visible. People cannot heal behaviors they do not recognize. But when avoidants become aware of their emotional defenses, they can slowly learn to tolerate vulnerability instead of automatically escaping from it. Ultimately, awareness transforms emotional chaos into emotional understanding. It helps people stop fighting invisible battles they do not understand. Instead of living in constant confusion, they gain language for the patterns, clarity about the dynamics, and the ability to respond with emotional intelligence rather than fear. And once clarity enters a relationship, people finally gain the power to choose healthier connection instead of endlessly repeating painful cycles they never understood before.